I was 9 when I first saw the hill that would change everything. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just a long ridge, the kind that sloped gently on one side and dropped steeply on the other. The grass grew in uneven patches, and little rocks poked out like teeth. But for me, it was more than a hill. My father had told me there were bones up there, old ones, older than our whole village, older than any story my grandmother had ever told. We lived in a small town in northern Greece where the air smelled like dry earth in the summer and pine in the winter. My father worked as a shepherd, but he had this habit of noticing things in the land. Strange rocks, odd shapes, tiny shells stuck in the dirt miles from the sea. He'd tell me, "The land keeps secrets, Yanis, but it also leaves clues, if you know how to look." It was late spring when he took me to the ridge. The cicadas were already buzzing, even though the sun hadn't reached its hottest. We walked along a faint path that wound up through wild thyme and low shrubs. My father didn't talk much that morning. He kept looking at the ground, scanning it like a man looking for a lost coin. "Here," he said finally, pointing at a patch of reddish soil. It didn't look special to me, just dirt with a few pale stones scattered around. But then I saw it. Not a stone. Not really. It was curved, smoother than any rock I'd seen, and it had these faint lines running across it. I crouched down. "Is it a shell?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not a shell. A piece of bone. And not from any animal you know." That's when my heart did that strange thing. Half fear, half excitement. I picked it up carefully. It was heavier than I thought. My fingers could feel the edges where it had broken long ago. We found more that day. Not a complete skeleton, just fragments, parts of a jaw, a bit of a skull, and something my father thought might have been part of a leg bone. He said he'd heard stories about scientists finding similar bones in other parts of the country and even across the border. But these weren't from humans like us. They were from something much older, a creature that walked upright, but not quite like we do. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way the curved bone had fit in my hand, like it had been waiting there for millions of years. The next week, my father took the bones to the small museum in the nearest city. They didn't seem like much at first. Just weathered, dirt-stained fragments. But the man at the museum, a paleontologist named Dr. Petros, reacted like he'd just been handed treasure. He asked us where we'd found them and if he could visit the site. When he came, he didn't come alone. There were 3 other scientists with him, each carrying packs filled with brushes, little picks, and notebooks. They didn't dig right away. First, they studied the slope, the soil layers, even the way the wind had shaped the hill. Dr. Petros told me they were looking for the context, that bones only told part of the story, but the ground around them could reveal the rest. It was during those days that I first heard the name Ouranopithecus. I thought it sounded like something from a storybook, some mythical giant or ancient god. But Dr. Petros explained it was the name of a genus of great apes that had lived here around 9 million years ago. 9 million. I couldn't even imagine it. My grandmother used to tell stories about our village going back 200 years, and that already felt like forever. But 9 million? That was older than humans, older than the idea of humans. He said Ouranopithecus were among the last of the European great apes before climate changes pushed their kind toward extinction. Or, as some scientists thought, before some of them migrated into Africa where their descendants might have become the earliest ancestors of humans. The thought made my chest tighten. Could the bones I held have belonged to something that was almost, but not quite, one of us? Over the summer, the scientists returned again and again. They didn't just look for bones. They sifted soil for plant fossils, examined the sediment for traces of ancient rivers, and even checked for pollen trapped in the layers. They told me that the Ouranopithecus's world had been different from ours, warmer, more forested, but starting to dry out in places. Grasslands were spreading, trees were thinning, and creatures that had once swung easily through the canopy might have been forced to walk more on the ground. One afternoon, while the others were working further down the slope, I sat with Dr. Petros under a tree. He was drawing in his notebook, not the bones themselves, but what he thought the creature might have looked like. Broad face, heavy brow ridge, long arms, not as upright as a person, but not as hunched as a chimpanzee. They were big, he said, noticing me watching. The males especially, maybe as heavy as a large man, but much stronger. Their teeth were large, too, built for chewing tough plants. I asked him if they were dangerous, like gorillas could be. Dangerous? He shrugged. Perhaps, but remember, they were not living in cities, not building weapons. They were simply surviving, just as the animals around them were. Danger wasn't about cruelty. It was about hunger or fear. That answer stuck with me. I had always thought of danger as something deliberate, like the wolves that sometimes stalked our sheep. But this was different. This was about a world where everything was fighting to stay alive in its own way. By the end of the season, they had enough material to send to a larger lab. My father and I visited once, months later, when the bones had been cleaned and catalogued. They looked strange on the white tables, bleached and smooth, each with a tiny label. Out of the ground, they seemed less like secrets and more like facts, but for me the hill was still whispering. I would go there alone sometimes, just to stand in the wind and imagine the place 9 million years ago, the calls of birds that no longer existed, the rustle of leaves from trees that had turned to stone or vanished entirely, and somewhere in the tall grass, a shape moving slowly on 2 legs, pausing to chew, then disappearing into the shadows. I didn't know it then, but finding those bones was only the beginning. The story of Ouranopithecus, and of what came before us, was far larger than a few fragments in the dirt. It was the story of change itself, of how the earth shaped its creatures, and how sometimes the difference between vanishing forever and becoming something new could be as thin as the edge of a tooth worn down over time. And I was about to follow that story wherever it led. When summer returned, it brought heat that shimmered over the hills like invisible waves. The grass had turned dry and sharp, crunching under my sandals, and the air smelled faintly of dust. The cicadas were louder than last year. Or maybe I just noticed them more now, because every sound on that ridge felt like it belonged to a world that was still trying to tell its story. I had been waiting for this, for the scientists to return. My father had said they might not come back. Funding was always uncertain, and there were so many other places for them to study. But in late May, I saw their van on the dirt road, its tires kicking up little storms behind it. They arrived with more equipment this time. Crates of tools, large tents for shade, and strange plastic sheets to cover the ground. Dr. Petros was there, smiling as he spotted me, and he waved me over like I was already part of the team. "Yanis," he said, "this season we're going deeper." I thought he meant digging deeper into the ground, and he did. But later I realized he also meant deeper into the questions. Last year had been about finding the bones. This year was about understanding them. The team set up their main work area on a slope just below where my father and I had first found the fragments. They marked out squares with string, like a giant checkerboard. Each square would be carefully scraped and brushed, layer by layer, so they could record exactly where each fragment came from. It wasn't like in the movies, where people just dug with shovels until they found something. Here, the dirt was treated like a fragile book, each page turned slowly so the story wouldn't tear. I was given small jobs at first, holding bags open for soil samples, carrying brushes and trowels from one square to another. But I paid attention. I watched the way they crouched low, sometimes lying on their sides, moving dirt with a brush that looked more suited for painting than digging. I noticed how they kept notebooks filled with tiny sketches and numbers, as if each crumb of bone had its own address in time. One day, I heard an excited shout from one of the younger scientists, a woman named Eleni. She had uncovered part of a jaw, not human, but not like any animal we knew. The teeth were large, with thick enamel, and one of the molars had a crack running across it like a dry riverbed. "This could tell us so much," she said, holding it gently. "How they ate, what plants they chewed, even how old they were when they died." Dr. Petros explained that the size and wear of the teeth could show whether Ouranopithecus ate mostly tough, fibrous plants or softer fruits. If the teeth were heavily worn, it might mean they lived in an environment where food was harder to find, and that could connect to the bigger question of why they eventually disappeared from Europe. I didn't say anything then, but I kept thinking about something he'd told me last year, about some scientists believing Ouranopithecus might be close to the common ancestor of humans and African apes. If that were true, then these teeth might belong to one of the far-off relatives of every person alive today. That idea made my skin prickle. The days fell into a rhythm, the quiet scraping of tools, the sudden calls when something was found, the constant rustle of the wind in the dry grass. Sometimes, when the heat grew too strong, the team gathered in the shade and talked about their work. It was during one of these breaks that I learned something new. They were comparing the bones from our site to ones found in other places, Bulgaria, Turkey, even parts of Africa. "You see," said Dr. Petros, sketching a simple map in the dirt. 9 million years ago, this whole region was connected, in ways it isn't today. There were no cities, no borders. The climate was shifting, forests were shrinking, grasslands expanding. Animals had to adapt or move. Some of the ancestors of African apes might have started their journey from here. I imagined groups of creatures, part ape and part something else, moving slowly across the land. Not migrating in a neat line, but wandering, following rivers, searching for food, staying alive. And over time, their children and their children's children ending up far from here, in places so different they might as well have been on another planet. In the afternoons, when most of the team was busy, cataloging finds, I would wander to the top of the ridge. From there, I could see the hills rolling away into the haze, the pale line of the road, and far in the distance, a silver flash that might have been a river. I would close my eyes and try to erase the houses, the fences, the power lines. I would imagine the land as it had been, trees scattered in the grasslands, herds of animals grazing, the shadow of a large shape moving slowly on 2 legs before vanishing into the shade. One evening, as the sun was turning the sky the color of copper, I sat with Eleni near the edge of the site. She was cleaning a fragment under a magnifying lens, the kind of work that made my hands itch to try. "Do you think," I asked, "that they knew? That they were going to disappear?" She didn't look up right away. "I think," she said slowly, "that no creature really knows that. They just live day by day. But maybe some of them felt the changes, less food, different trees, more ground to cross to find water. They would have noticed, even if they didn't understand." That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the crickets outside. I thought about the hill and the bones, and how something that had been alive 9 million years ago could still be speaking to us now, through stone and dust. The season lasted 2 months. When the last week came, the team uncovered something extraordinary, a partial skull, more complete than any they'd found before. It wasn't perfect. Parts were broken, and the bone was fragile. But you could see the shape of the face, the curve of the brow. When they lifted it, Everyone gathered around. Even I held my breath. It was strange. Looking at it, I didn't feel fear or even awe exactly. I felt recognition. Not like seeing a person I knew, but like catching the echo of a voice I'd heard once in a dream. Dr. Petros smiled when he saw me staring. "Yanis," he said, "you've met someone who lived long before humans ever walked the earth. And yet without them, we might not be here at all." I didn't know it then, but that summer was the start of something for me. Not just a fascination, but a kind of responsibility. The bones in the hill weren't just theirs. They were ours too, part of a story still unfolding, and I was determined to follow it. By the time the leaves began to turn yellow in the autumn after that second summer, I thought the hill had told me all its secrets. The scientists had packed up their equipment, the tents were gone, and the slope looked bare again, like a book, with its pages closed. But one afternoon, while I was helping my father mend a section of the fence, a letter came. It was from Dr. Petros. His handwriting was small and neat, and the paper smelled faintly like the dust of the excavation site. He wrote that they were traveling to other parts of the country, places with fossils from the same time as our Ouranopithecus, bones, and he asked if I wanted to come for a few weeks during the spring. My father read the letter twice before looking at me. "You'd be away from home," he said. "Sleeping in tents, working in the sun, eating whatever the team eats. It's not just an adventure, it's work." I didn't even have to think about it. "I want to go." That spring, we met the team in a valley far to the north, near the border. It was different from our hills, greener, with forests that seemed to whisper to each other in the wind. The dig site was on a low ridge that overlooked a dry riverbed. They said that millions of years ago, it had been a wide river with banks, shaded by tall trees. Here the soil was lighter, almost sandy, and the fossils were buried in layers that told a different story than our hill. Instead of mostly bone fragments, they found a mix, bits of teeth from antelopes, the curved claws of some small carnivore, and even the impression of leaves pressed into stone like delicate lace. I learned quickly that every site had its own personality. Ours had been stubborn, giving up its bones slowly, almost reluctantly. This one was generous, spilling small discoveries every day. But what fascinated me most was how the scientists read the land as if it were a diary. The type of soil, the angle of the layers, the size of the pebbles in the ancient riverbed. One evening, as we sat around a small campfire, Eleni explained something I hadn't thought about before. "Ouranopithecus wasn't the only creature living here," she said. "There were dozens of species sharing the same space. Understanding them helps us understand why Ouranopithecus lived the way it did, and why it disappeared." She showed me a tooth they had found that day, tiny compared to the massive molars of Ouranopithecus. "This is from a small monkey," she said. "They lived in the trees. While Ouranopithecus spent more time on the ground, these monkeys stayed up high. Two species, two strategies. Sometimes one strategy works better when the world changes." I thought about that as I lay in my tent later, listening to the forest. Strategies. That was what life was, finding ways to survive when the world decided to change the rules. The days were long and the work was steady. I learned to use a trowel without scraping bone, to sift soil without losing a single pebble-sized fossil. Sometimes the older scientist would test me, holding up a fragment and asking, "Bone or rock?" At first I got it wrong more often than right, but slowly I began to see the subtle signs, the porous texture, the way bone caught the light differently. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, turning the valley golden, we uncovered something remarkable. Not Ouranopithecus, but the lower half of a mandible from a completely different species. It was smaller, more delicate, with teeth shaped for eating softer plants. "This," Dr. Petros said, is why we compare sites. Every new piece helps fill in the picture of the ecosystem. I began to imagine the valley as it had been. Herds of grazing animals, the calls of birds now extinct, the rustle of something large moving between the trees, and somewhere among them, Ouranopithecus, watching, chewing, living its day without knowing it would end up as a puzzle for people, millions of years later. In the second week, the team decided to visit a third site, this one across the border in a drier, rockier region. The land was harsher here, the hills almost bare except for stubborn shrubs. The fossils were harder to find, and the wind carried fine dust that clung to our skin, but this place held its own kind of magic. The sediment layers were older here, and the bones we found belonged to species even more primitive than Ouranopithecus, early apes that might have been its ancestors. It was here that I learned about the idea of ghost lineages, species that must have existed because of the gap between known fossils, but whose bones had never been found. They're like missing pages in a story, Eleni explained. We know the beginning and the end of a chapter, so something had to be in between, but until we find them, they're just shadows. That thought stayed with me for days. How many stories were buried in the earth that no one would ever read? How many creatures had lived, struggled, and vanished without leaving a single trace for us to find? By the time we returned home, my head was full of images. Valleys turning to plains, rivers drying up, forests shrinking, and creatures adapting in ways that would shape the future. But there was something else, too. A growing sense that the story of Ouranopithecus was more than just a scientific mystery. It was part of a chain that linked everything that had ever lived to everything that lived now. Back in my village, the hill where I had first held a fragment of jawbone seemed smaller. Somehow, but also more important, it wasn't just our hill. It was a chapter in a story that stretched across continents and millions of years. I didn't know it yet, but the next time the scientists returned, they would bring news that would change everything we thought we knew about where Ouranopithecus, and perhaps even we, had come from. By the winter after our trips to the other sites, the village had grown used to me carrying strange stories home about jawbones, ancient rivers, and ghost lineages. My grandmother liked to tease me, saying I spent more time thinking about monkey people than about my schoolwork. But she also kept every fossil leaflet and photograph I brought back, tucking them into a little box as if they were treasure. When the scientists returned the next summer, I expected more digging, more slow brushing of dirt from stubborn fragments. What I didn't expect was that they would arrive with a theory, one that made the whole team hum with excitement. It started on their first evening back. The air was warm, and the light over the hills was soft and gold. We sat on low stools outside my father's house, the smell of thyme from the cooking drifting through the air. Dr. Petros leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and began speaking in that careful way he used when he wanted to make sure every word landed. "Yanis," he said, "you know how we've been comparing our finds with fossils from Africa?" I nodded. I'd heard him talk before about the oldest human ancestors found in East Africa, the ones that lived several million years after Ouranopithecus. "Well," he continued, "we've been looking closely at the teeth from our site and the sites in Bulgaria and Turkey. The shape, the thickness of the enamel, they're not exactly like the African apes of the same period. In some ways, they're closer to what we see in the earliest hominins." I frowned. "You mean closer to humans?" He smiled. "Possibly. What we're thinking, and it's still just a theory, is that maybe, just maybe, the lineage that led to humans didn't start only in Africa. Maybe part of it began here, in Europe, with creatures like Ouranopithecus. And then, when the climate changed, some of them moved south into Africa, carrying their traits with them." I sat back, trying to let that settle in my mind. It was like hearing that your family might have another branch you'd never known about, not far away, but right under your feet. Eleni joined in. It doesn't mean humans are European or African in origin, she said quickly, because evolution is complicated. Populations move, mix, and change over time. But it does mean that Europe might have played a bigger role than we once thought. For the next few days, the sight felt different. Every fragment of bone seemed heavier, every tooth more important. The idea that our hill might hold clues to the deep roots of humanity made even the smallest discovery feel like a piece of something enormous. But the theory also brought questions. In the evenings, I'd hear the scientists debating in low voices. Some argued that the similarities in teeth could be coincidence, that Ouranopithecus might simply have evolved thicker enamel for its own diet without any connection to human ancestors. Others pointed out that without DNA from the fossils, it was impossible to be certain. Still, the possibility lit a fire under the team. They expanded the excavation, opening new trenches lower down the slope. I was allowed to help more this year, carefully brushing soil from around a buried rib, holding shade cloths over delicate finds while photographs were taken. One afternoon, as I worked near the edge of a trench, my trowel scraped against something hard. I froze, then gently brushed away the dirt until a rounded edge appeared. It was a tooth, not large but broad, with a thick layer of enamel. I called for Eleni, and when she saw it, she let out a low whistle. "This," she said, "is from the upper jaw, and it's in good condition." Later, under the microscope, in their small field lab, she showed me the fine ridges on the surface. "These patterns," she said, "tell us about the diet. See here? This wear is from chewing tough, gritty plants, but here, these scratches, that could be from eating fruit or softer vegetation." I thought about the valley she had described, last year with forests thinning and grasslands spreading. "So they ate whatever they could find?" I asked. The end was something we never saw, only guessed at. The fossils gave us the middle of the story, but the last chapter, how the last Ouranopithecus died, was missing. Maybe the changing climate had pushed them beyond their limits. Maybe new predators had arrived, or maybe slowly, over generations, they had changed into something else entirely, their old form vanishing into a new one. By mid-season, the trench had produced enough material to send to labs in Athens and even farther away. The team worked late into the evenings, packing the finds into padded crates. They let me write the labels for some of them. Neat letters, the way my school teacher insisted, because these were going to be read by people I would never meet. One night, after the others had gone to sleep, I sat outside and looked up at the stars. I thought about the creatures whose bones we had found, living their short lives under a sky that must have looked almost the same. Did they ever look up? Did they ever wonder what was beyond the trees and rivers they knew? Or was the world for them only what they could touch, smell, and taste? When the team left that year, they promised to write as soon as the lab results came back. I waited through autumn, through the first rains, through the frost that dusted the hills white, and then, in late winter, another letter arrived. The results, it said, were intriguing, enough that they were preparing a paper for a scientific journal. They still couldn't prove the theory, but the evidence was strong enough that other researchers were taking notice. I didn't know what a scientific paper really meant, but I understood one thing. The bones in our hill were no longer just a local curiosity. They were part of a conversation that stretched across the world, about where we came from and how far back our story went. I folded the letter and slipped it into the box my grandmother kept, because I had the feeling this was only the beginning. The letter inviting me to Athens came in early spring, folded neatly inside a larger envelope from Dr. Petros. At first, I thought it was just another update about the fossils, but then I saw my name printed in big, careful letters on a separate sheet. "We're reconstructing the skull," it said. "If you can come to the university lab, I think you'll want to see this." I read it twice before running outside to find my father. He was mending a fence post, and I handed him the letter without saying a word. He squinted at it for a moment, then looked up at me with a small smile. "Seems like you've been invited to meet an old friend," he said. The journey to Athens felt longer than it was. I'd never been to the capital before, and the train ride seemed to take me through a dozen different worlds. Hills that looked like our own, then flat fields, then rocky slopes covered with olive trees. The air changed too. By the time we arrived, it was warmer and carried the faint tang of the sea. The university building was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd pictured something ancient, all stone columns and marble steps, but the lab where we met the team was modern. White walls, bright lights, shelves lined with boxes and trays. It smelled faintly of chemicals, like something between a hospital and a school science room. Dr. Petros greeted us at the door. He looked different out of the field, clean-shaven, wearing a crisp shirt instead of his dusty hat and field jacket. But when he smiled, it was the same. "Come," he said, his voice low. "You need to see this." We followed him into a side room where a long table stood under a row of lights. At one end was a collection of tools, tiny brushes, dental picks, magnifying glasses. At the other was something covered with a soft cloth. Eleni was there too, leaning over the table. She pulled the cloth back, and there it was, the skull. It wasn't whole. Some parts were still missing, but the team had filled the gaps with a pale resin shaped to match what they knew from other fossils. The bone itself was a deep, warm brown, polished from careful cleaning. Even with the repairs, it looked ancient, as if the earth had left its mark in every curve and line. But it wasn't the color or the texture that struck me. It was the shape. The brow ridge was heavy, the face broad and flat compared to ours, but the eye sockets were round and forward-facing, just like ours. I couldn't stop looking at them. They weren't alive, but they gave the skull a strange presence, as if someone, not something, had been behind them once. "This is as close as we've come to seeing Ouranopithecus as it was," Eleni said softly. "The skull you helped us find gave us the foundation. With other fragments from the site and comparisons to related species, we could reconstruct most of it." I reached out without thinking, then stopped, afraid to touch it. "You can," Dr. Petros said. "Gently." I ran my fingertips over the brow ridge, the smooth curve of the resin where the bone was missing. I thought about the creature it belonged to, standing on the ground of our hill, maybe looking toward the same horizon I saw every day. "How old was it?" I asked. "From the teeth, we think it was an adult," Eleni said. "Not very old, but not young either. Maybe the equivalent of 30 in human years." I tried to imagine it, not as a skull, but alive, broad-shouldered, moving on two legs but still using its arms for balance, chewing on some tough plant while watching for danger. But then Eleni handed me something even stranger, a model. They had worked with an artist to create a facial reconstruction using the skull as the base and adding muscles, skin, and hair, based on what they knew from other great apes. It wasn't an exact portrait. They couldn't know the exact color of the eyes or the texture of the fur. But it was close enough to make my stomach turn in a way I couldn't explain. It looked real. The brow ridge gave it a stern expression, but the mouth was relaxed, and the eyes, deep set under the heavy brow, seemed to watch me. Not like an animal, but not like a human either. Something in between. For a moment, the lab disappeared. I was on the ridge again, the wind in my face, and this being was there, shifting its weight from foot to foot, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth noticing. "Yanis?" My father's voice pulled me back. I realized I'd been staring for a long time. "What do you think?" Dr. Petros asked. I searched for the right words. "It looks like it's thinking, like it knows something," he smiled. "That's what makes it powerful. It's not just a fossil anymore. It's a life, imagined from bones. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the lab looking at other specimens from different sites, teeth, vertebrae, even tiny finger bones. But nothing stayed with me like the skull and the reconstruction. Before we left, Eleni handed me a small photograph of the model. "Keep it," she said. "It's a reminder of what you helped bring back into the world." On the train ride home, I kept the photo in my lap. The face looked out at me with that same unreadable expression. I wondered what it would have thought of me. A skinny boy from a village it would never know, staring at it millions of years later. When we got back, I showed my grandmother. She stared at the picture for a long time, her thumb brushing the edge of the paper. "It looks old," she said finally, "but not strange. Like family." That night I put the photograph in the box with the letters, but I didn't close the lid right away. I left it open, the face looking out, as if it still had something to say, and I had the feeling it wasn't done speaking to me yet. Summer had barely started when the second letter came. I'd been helping my father clear stones from the lower field, sweating under the weight of the sun, when my grandmother called me from the house. She was waving something in her hand. The pale envelope that by now I recognized instantly. It was from Eleni, but this time the handwriting was hurried, the letters uneven. "We found something far to the north, near the Axios River. It might be connected to your hill, and maybe even to the earliest hominins. If you can come, we'll explain everything." There was no date for sometime later this time. The message was urgent. "We start the excavation in 3 days. I read it twice, then again. My father looked at me, shielding his eyes from the sun. "Well, I have to go," I said. The journey north felt different from the trip to Athens. The train carried me away from the dry hills of home into land that seemed more alive. Tall grasses swaying in the wind, wide stretches of farmland, and in the distance, a silver line that I guessed was the Axios River itself. The air was heavier here, the kind that stuck to your skin. When I reached the camp, it was nothing like the tidy lab in Athens. Tents were set up in haphazard rows along the bank, and there were wooden crates everywhere, some half open, filled with tools. Plaster rolls and water jugs. The hum of insects was constant. Eleni met me at the edge of the site. She looked more tired than I'd ever seen her, hair tied up, boots muddy, hands streaked with dust. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading me toward the dig. "This place is different. The river changes everything. It's been depositing layers here for millions of years. The fossils are mixed with sediments from floods, so it's like a time capsule." She pointed to a section of the riverbank where a steep wall of earth had been cut away, revealing stripes of color, pale beige, rust red, almost black. People in wide-brimmed hats were crouched along the ledges, chipping carefully at the layers. "This," she said, "is where it gets strange." She led me to a spot where a square of earth had been cordoned off with rope. Inside, partially exposed in the dirt, was a long curve of bone. At first, I thought it was just another animal, a deer maybe, but as I looked closer, I saw it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. The shape was wrong, the proportions different. "It's a femur," Eleni said quietly, "and it's not human." I crouched down. The bone was thick, more massive than a person's, but not as big as a gorilla's. The surface was worn smooth in places, but the ends, where it had broken, showed a dense, almost stone-like interior. "How old is it?" I asked. "Too early to say for certain," she replied, "but from the layer we found it in, maybe 8 or 9 million years." That number hit me harder than I expected. Our hill had been old, around 9 million too, but this was far away, near the river, as if the same kind of beings had lived in both places. As the sun dipped lower, the camp began to feel like a living thing. Voices calling for brushes, or plaster, the thud of shovels, the distant rush of the river. At dinner under the mess tent, the team spoke in bursts of excitement and exhaustion. I caught bits of conversation. Pelvis fragment. Unusual articulation. Could indicate bipedalism. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the river. It sounded nothing like the quiet wind at home. This was constant, restless, as if it wanted to wash everything away. I wondered how many bones it had carried, how many stories it had buried, and revealed again. The next morning, I was put to work clearing loose soil from one of the deeper trenches. The air was thick and smelled faintly of algae. Every so often, I'd glance up and see Eleni bent over the femur, working slowly, like she was afraid to scare it away. By midday, there was a sudden stir near the main trench. I heard someone shout for plaster, and a small crowd gathered. I wiped my hands and went to see. In the soil was something small but unmistakable. The arc of a jawbone with teeth still rooted in place. The enamel gleamed faintly in the sun, pale against the earth. "Is it the same species?" I asked. "Possibly," Eleni said, crouching beside it. "If it is, this changes the picture. Two sites, far apart with similar fossils. That suggests a much wider range than we thought." That evening, she spread out a map on the camp table. She pointed to our hill in the south, then to the Axios site far to the north. "If we can connect these populations," she said, "we might be looking at one of the earliest common ancestors of later hominins. Not Homo Sapiens, not even Australopithecus, but something at the root of the branch." I stared at the line between the 2 points on the map. It was only a few centimeters on paper, but in reality, it was a whole world. Mountains, rivers, forests, and millions of years of change. "What if there are more sites in between?" I asked. Her eyes lit up. "Exactly. That's what we have to find." On the third day, the river rose. Not by much, just enough to muddy the lower trenches and make the banks slippery. But the water brought something with it. In a shallow pool near the bend, one of the workers spotted a fragment of bone rolling in the current. When they pulled it out, it turned out to be another jaw, smaller than the first, but with the same forward projecting teeth. I held it in my hands, dripping, and cool. It felt alive somehow, like it had only just let go of the being it belonged to. By the end of the week, we had pieces of at least 3 individuals: femur, jaws, parts of a pelvis, scattered vertebrae. The scientists worked late into the night laying them out on tarps, comparing measurements, sketching. When I left the site, Eleni pressed a small notebook into my hand. "Keep writing down what you see," she said. "This story is only beginning." On the train home, I opened the notebook. Inside, she had written one line on the first page: "The river doesn't just carry water, it carries time." I stared at it for a long time, the sound of the Axios still in my ears. I had the feeling I'd be back before long. The call came at dawn, 3 weeks after I'd left the Axios river site. I was still half asleep when the phone buzzed on the table beside my bed. Eleni's voice was sharp and fast, words tumbling over one another. "There's been a collapse at the riverbank, a landslide. No one's hurt, but you need to come, now." I didn't even pack a bag. By afternoon, I was stepping out of the train into the heavy northern air again, the smell of wet soil thick around me. The camp was unrecognizable. The neat trenches I'd worked in were buried under fresh mounds of earth. The once steep bank had slumped forward toward the water, leaving a jagged scar where the layers had been sliced open. Eleni led me toward the largest mound, her boots sinking into the soft ground. "The floodwaters loosened it," she explained. "Half the western wall gave way. But when it fell, it revealed something." We rounded the mound, and I froze. In the exposed cut of earth, just above where the workers were now shoring up. The bank, there was a hollow. It wasn't a random pocket left by water. The edges were smooth, almost deliberate, like something had been dug out long ago, and inside, partially covered in silt, were bones. Not scattered, but arranged. The first thing I noticed was the skull, smaller than ours, but not by much, its brow ridges heavy, the jaw slightly jutting forward. Around it, laid in a rough circle, were long bones, ribs, and fragments of stone. Eleni crouched beside the hollow, brushing gently at the dirt. "It's not just the position," she said. "Look closer." I did. One of the stones wasn't just a rock. Its edges were chipped, forming a sharp edge. Another had been worn smooth, as if used for grinding. "They made these," I said slowly. "That's the thing," she replied. "If the dating is right, this would mean tool use far earlier than we've ever confirmed. And the arrangement—" She trailed off, then said softly, "It might mean they buried their dead." I stared at her. 9 million years ago? That's impossible. Her expression was grim. "It shouldn't be possible, but it's here." The rest of that day was spent stabilizing the hollow. Every move was deliberate. Photographs, sketches, measurements. The workers built a wooden frame over the opening to keep the soil from collapsing further. By evening, the skull was free enough to lift. I held my breath as they passed it from hand to hand, wrapped in linen. Its weight in my arms was more than physical. This was someone. That night, the camp was quieter than usual. The air felt heavy, as if we'd all stepped into a space we weren't supposed to enter. Around the fire, people spoke in low voices, arguing about what it meant. One of the older archaeologists shook his head. "We're seeing what we want to see. Stones and bones, nothing more." Eleni didn't argue. She just stared into the flames. But the next morning, something changed. While clearing debris from the base of the collapse, a worker uncovered another hollow, smaller, but lined with flat stones. Inside were fragments of charcoal. Charcoal. When Eleni tested it with the portable analyzer, she let out a low whistle. "Burned wood. Definitely not natural, and it's from the same layer as the burial." I thought of the river's constant rush, the way it carried bits of the past downstream. How many times had water almost erased this? How many other sites like this had already been lost without anyone knowing? As the days passed, the picture became clearer. We weren't looking at a random landslide find. We were looking at a preserved moment, a small group of beings living by the river, using tools, tending fire, and perhaps honoring their dead. At night, I kept thinking about the skull's face. I'd seen reconstructions in textbooks of creatures from this era. Heavy-browed, flat-nosed, with long arms and short legs. But now I imagined this one looking at the river, placing stones carefully around another's body, watching the fire burn. By the end of the week, Eleni called the whole team together. She stood on the edge of the excavation, the scar of the collapse yawning behind her. "This changes everything," she said simply. "If we're right about the dating, then Ouranopithecus, or something closely related, wasn't just an ape with an odd walk. They were doing things we associate with much later species. This isn't the story we thought we knew." She looked at me then, and I knew what she meant without her saying it. This wasn't just about science anymore. It was about rewriting the first chapter of who we are. That evening, before I turned in, I walked down to the river alone. The water was low again, the mud still soft from the collapse. I stood where the current curled around the bend, imagining the same river millions of years ago, quieter maybe, but carrying the same restless pull. I found a flat stone in the shallows, its surface smooth. Without really thinking about it, I set it down beside the water, the way I'd seen in the hollow. A small gesture, meaningless to anyone else. But as I walked back to camp, I kept glancing over my shoulder at that single stone, sitting there, in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, might understand exactly why I'd placed it there. The news broke before we were ready. Someone leaked photographs of the burial site to an online science blog. Within hours, the images were everywhere. The skull cradled in linen, the chipped stones, the neat ring of bones. The captions were speculative, dramatic. 9-million-year-old burial challenges human evolution timeline. Did Ouranopithecus honor its dead? By the next morning, reporters were standing at the train station in Thessaloniki, shouting questions as passengers stepped off. And behind them came the suits. Not archaeologists, not scientists, but government officials and private representatives from heritage organizations, their briefcases heavy with documents. In the mess tent, Eleni slammed her coffee down so hard it splashed across the table. This isn't about science anymore. It's about who gets to own the past. 2 men from the ministry arrived first. They smiled too much, nodded too politely, and said words like national treasure and security concerns. They wanted the skull and tools moved immediately to a secure facility in Athens. For preservation, they said. Eleni refused. Preservation means context, she told them. If you take these out of the ground before we finish, you destroy the story they tell. But they weren't the only ones who wanted the site. A private foundation, with deep pockets and an interest in early human evolution, offered funding in exchange for first rights to study the find. Their representative wore a silver watch that gleamed under the tent lights, his voice smooth as silk. "You're doing great work here," he said to me when we spoke alone. "But imagine what you could do with our resources, labs, technology, international experts. Why let politics slow this down?" I didn't answer. I'd already noticed the men with his logo on their jackets standing near the excavation, their eyes scanning the ground like they were taking inventory. That night, rain swept through the camp. I couldn't sleep. The canvas walls shuddered. Under the wind and in the distance, the river's voice grew louder, angrier. Just after midnight, Eleni came into my tent. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, her flashlight beam trembling. "The river's rising," she said. "We have hours, maybe less, before the lower trench floods." We woke the whole camp. People grabbed buckets, boards, anything to divert the flow, but the water kept coming. Mud oozed under our boots, and the air smelled sharp, metallic. The burial site, the hollow was already slick with runoff. The wooden frame we'd built was bowing under the pressure. "Get the skull and tools out," Eleni ordered. "Everything else we document as fast as possible." I slid into the trench, the mud sucking at my knees. My hands shook as I wrapped the artifacts, one by one, sealing them in padded cases. Around me, flashlights darted like fireflies, voices calling measurements and coordinates into the storm. By 3 a.m., the water was lapping at the edge of the trench. We'd saved what we could. The rest, the stone-lined fire pit, the delicate arrangement of ribs, vanished under the rushing. Brown flood. When dawn came, the river had claimed half the bank. Where the burial had been, there was only water, swirling with bits of branch and silt. The officials arrived later that morning, their polished shoes sinking into the mud. They didn't look happy. But when they saw the sealed crates holding the skull and tools, their expressions softened. "These will be taken to Athens for safekeeping," one of them said firmly. "Effective immediately." Eleni's jaw tightened. "They stay under our supervision until the analysis is complete." The man's smile was small and cold. "That's not your decision." I thought she might argue, but she didn't. She just nodded, as if saving what we had, even under someone else's control, was better than losing it entirely. 2 days later, the site was abandoned. The mud hardened under the sun, sealing the last traces of the hollow. From the bridge upstream, the river looked calm again, as if it had never given us anything, and never taken it back. I stayed in Thessaloniki for a week before heading home. One evening, walking along the waterfront, I saw a fishing boat come in, its nets heavy. Among the catch, tangled in weeds, was a flat stone, smooth, oval, the kind you could hold comfortably in your palm. I thought of the one I'd placed by the river that night weeks ago, and the one from the burial site, worn by a hand millions of years older than mine. It struck me then that maybe the river wasn't just taking things away. Maybe it was keeping them, holding them until someone came along who was ready to understand. Eleni called me months later. The carbon dating on the charcoal was conclusive, 9 million years, and the stone tools showed deliberate shaping, primitive but undeniable. They can argue all they want, she said, her voice tinged with quiet triumph. The evidence speaks, but she didn't sound entirely happy. The skull's in Athens now, locked away. They say it's for preservation, but I haven't seen it since they took it. No one has. I pictured that hollow again, the stones, the bones, the stillness of it, and realized something. We hadn't just found a fossil. We'd stumbled into the middle of a story that started long before us and would keep flowing long after we were gone. And the river would remember all of it.